I'm a firm believer that economics tend to be the great equalizer, or maybe not equality. It's not that economics bring equality; they quite the contrary. But economics are the sort of the great harmonizer, in the sense that maybe you and I are different than one another, but if we have a common economic interest, we're much more likely to overlook those differences than we are if we didn't have those common economic interests. Mm-hmm. And I would say that in both cases, economics holds the promise, perhaps, of increased cooperation between groups, and I dare even say an incipient form of multiculturalism. But that's not the case, in the sense that you basically have identities that are not fixed. They're not static. They're mobile, and they've been influenced by history, by contemporary affairs, and yet they're ones that sort of refuse to cooperate because there hasn't been this sort of prize for cooperation. There hasn't been this promise of a greater economic situatedness if we cooperate with one another, right? And the economic exchanges that we tend to see in those societies do take place between cultures, between genders, between people of various backgrounds, but they're largely not the norm. They tend to be the exception, right? Most of what we see are groups of like mind, like skin color. And I don't want to keep referring to skin color because I think ethnicity, ethno-nationalism is much more of a significant factor in both Syria and Pakistan than say color would be, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say is that people of different ethnicities have not had the sort of the interest in cooperating economically because it has not been delivered to them, right? And the reason for that is because in both societies we see economic stagnation, right? We see incredibly high rates of unemployment. We see an incredibly high rate of poverty in both cases, especially in Pakistan, much more than Syria. And we basically see that the sort of economic prosperity that would perhaps allow people to come together without regard for ethnicity, without regard for national origin, is not really there yet, right? So I suspect that if there was a sort of a prosperity that takes root in both cases, there would be much more of a tendency to want to coalesce around that prosperity. And yet I suspect that the lack of prosperity is the result of the lack of cooperation between those groups. And I don't want to pin it on either the lack of multiculturalism and say, that's the reason why we don't have economic cooperation. One could easily argue that the lack of economic cooperation is why we don't have a multiculturalist ethos in both cases.